Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the OGH. My name's Rob Shepherd. I have the pleasure to be the chairman of the Guernsey Literary Festival, and I get to do great things like welcome you all and get involved in these kind of events. It's a real privilege. Now, when we were sitting in our board meetings in sort of February, March and April this year, working out how we were going to do this festival, one of the things we talked about was what could go wrong? And the obvious answer was the IT. And I'm sorry to say that we have had an IT issue, which is why we're running a bit late. So the video is not going to be working in this room, so you will not see Steve Richards. It will be audio only in this room. I'm really sorry about this. But the oddity is that he will still be able to see us. So be behaved. And if you want to watch it, if you were watching it on the live stream, you would see everything. And if you want to go back later today and watch it again on the live stream, you will see everything. So we have a sort of a very intimate podcast in this room. I'm really sorry about this. We've tried all our very best, and Joy's have been running around, as you would have seen, like mad things, trying to sort it. But some things are just not going to be sorted. And this was the conversation we had back in our meeting in February. For those of you who might have been at the talk last night, Bertrand Rivett-Carnac, he had this phrase of stubborn optimism. So I'd ask you all to adopt a posture of stubborn optimism and get on with the rest of the morning and your life, indeed. So I'm sorry about that. My job is to give thank yous in advance. So first of all, thank you to Butterfield for sponsoring this event. It's, as you know, we all say this, but it's absolutely true. It wouldn't happen unless people like Butterfield were prepared to help us. They're the people who said to us last year, keep your money, roll it over, you'll be back. And that's tremendously encouraging to us. So Guy Quigley's here from Butterfield and a number of others. How often do you get applause before you've spoken, Guy? Oh, okay, fine. So thank you to them. Thank you to Will Green from the press, who's going to lead this, who I'm sure was a bit nervous beforehand. Might be all the more daunting now. So thank you, Will, for doing this. It's really kind of you. And obviously the usual housekeeping points. Please turn your phones off. Mute if you have to, but off is much better. There was a photographer in the room, not just any photographer. There's Chris George in the room. So please be behaved. And as I remind you, it is a live stream. You can't see it, but please be behaved. Thank you. Over to you, Will.
Well, good morning. You'll have to put up with my face, I'm afraid, for a bit, but hopefully that'll be okay. So my name's Will Green. I'm the business editor at the Guernsey Press, and welcome to the Business Breakfast. We've got renowned political writer Steve Richards, and it's brilliant you're all here in person and via the internet to hear him speak. Thank you. It's also a great privilege for me to be able to take part in an event like this for such a great festival organised by Claire Allen and her team. I think we should give them a round of applause as well. And kindly sponsored by Butterfield. I have to say, you know, your support brings the world of books and their authors to our shores, and that is just brilliant. Now, politics is something really close to my heart. I worked as a political editor for several years in the Houses of Parliament, so it's fair to say I've really enjoyed reading Steve's book on British Prime Ministers. It lit up my memories of being at some of the events and meeting some of those Prime Ministers. Steve really is someone you want to read and turn to if you want to understand politics. His book offers a breadth of thought, expertise and insights, all done with a real human face. That's why Steve is much in demand. A political columnist, journalist and presenter, Steve is a regular voice on BBC Radio 4's The Week in Westminster. He writes for several national newspapers, including The Guardian. His impressive CV includes Chief Political Reporter at The Independent and Political Editor at The New Statesman. He also fronts a popular political show each year at the Edinburgh Festival. Now, just before turning to Steve, the plan for today is that Steve will talk about his book for about 15-20 minutes. He and I will then have a chat and explore some of the themes of the book. It's then open to you, the audience, for your questions. Our sponsor will then wrap things up probably I'd say about 20 to 10, something like that. Without further ado, I was going to say hand you over to Steve Richards, but we'll listen to him on audio now. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I think we can all agree right away this is the most surreal event we've all attended, because, as others have said, I can indeed see you, those live in the hall, and yeah, I'm waving too. Nice to see you all. I was so excited because, just to be almost in a hall with you I couldn't sleep with the excitement, because this has been not possible in the UK, certainly for the last year or so. And now you can't see me, but those watching on the live stream can. And if you want to see back, I'm wearing a white shirt. I have got all my bookshelves prepared for you to have a look at if you were sort of bored with the talk. So have a look back. And I've had a very bad haircut. I'm wearing a white shirt, and now I'm going to get talking. And thank you for understanding that there's been anyway, I can see everything's working okay at my end at the moment, and I can see all of you. It seems to me, if it's okay with you, if I talk for about 15 minutes, British politics at the moment is like one of those really good, compelling thrillers where nothing is quite what it seems, which is always the most exciting thriller. There's a surface narrative, but lots is happening underneath, which in a way contradicts that narrative. It's very different from the Brexit saga, which was like a sort of helter-skelter thriller. Every day there would be a dramatic twist, but it was all on the surface. We could tell that Theresa May wasn't strong and stable, to quote Theresa May. We could see that there was no majority in that House of Commons for any Brexit until Boris Johnson came along and won a landslide. It was all on the surface. Now, in British politics, there is a surface narrative of Boris Johnson in triumph, Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland in triumph, and Keir Starmer's Labour Party in complete disarray. That is true to some extent. All surface narratives in thrillers are true, or else the thriller wouldn't stand up. But there are deeper twists. Boris Johnson has won all these seats, partly on the back of Brexit, but on a promise to level up in the north of England, and no one quite knows what that means, including Boris Johnson. So, as is often the case with prime ministers, the seeds of their glory can bring about, ultimately, their fall. Sturgeon seems triumphant, but yet she faces the ultimate dilemma now. How does she get an independence referendum if Boris Johnson is determined to block it? And if she were to get it, will she win? And if she doesn't win, she is finished. So both those triumphant figures, and they are triumphant, both are incredibly powerful in their different spheres at the moment. Boris Johnson, I would argue, is the most powerful prime minister in Britain since Margaret Thatcher in the late 1980s. Blair won big, but he had a counter force in the Treasury in the form of Gordon Brown. Johnson could do what he wants. And while Labour are in complete disarray and being poorly led by Keir Starmer, who isn't a leaderly figure, it was actually making inroads in places it would have died to have made inroads in the 1980s. Solid in London, gaining places that used to be strong Tory areas, Oxford, Cambridge. It's a very strange situation. And I say that because that's what motivated me to write the book on British prime ministers. As some of you know, the British media gets very overexcited and frenzied, and I think they tend to report the surface narrative always, and loses the really interesting three-dimensional elements. I remember as a kid, very young, 10 or 11, Harold Wilson was prime minister in the mid-70s, and I never understood it. I read all the time that he was bonkers, paranoid, neurotic, useless. And as a sort of 10-year-old, I thought, well, how does he keep on winning elections? And indeed, winning a referendum on Europe. And then, of course, you look a bit deeper and it's more complicated. And so it is with all the prime ministers. The one of modern times, I've written from Harold Wilson to Boris Johnson, the modern era, TV era, social media era. The one who is highly distinct is indeed Johnson. He is the biggest risk taker of British prime ministers, who tend to be fairly cautious figures. He is willing to do extraordinary things, for good or bad, that's up to you. So, for example, when he became Prime Minister in July 2019, it's easy to forget that was that hung parliament. The government was losing vote after vote. All prime ministers who rule in hung parliaments are tormented, exhausted, and they spend all their time trying to keep their party together, to woo other parties to support legislation. It tormented John Major. It drove Harold Wilson to a form of craziness. And he found it so hard he resigned in 1976. It drove James Callaghan mad from 76 to 79. Hung Parliament, he used to sing hymns because he was in despair. Johnson did the exact opposite. He came in a hung Parliament, said Brexit would be done, do or die. He didn't mean it because there was no means he could do it at the time. And he then expelled key figures in his parliamentary party in an extraordinary purge. If you remember, he purged, suspended the whip from Ken Clarke. He turned Philip Hammond, the former Chancellor, who's the most dangerous thing he had ever done was to drive a car quite fast. He turned Hammond into a sort of revolutionary figure, this rather staid former Chancellor of the Exchequer. And in purging these figures who hadn't supported him on Brexit, he was incredibly bold, taking risks that could have led to the implosion of his party. Instead, he won an election in December 2019, and he is one of the big vote winners in this book. There is a pattern to the vote winners, which I think is interesting and important, and I think an essential qualification of leadership. The vote winners are the performers, the political teachers. They can tell a story and they try to make sense of what they are doing. And they are actors. And I don't say that in a derogatory way. But if you look at the big winners in modern times, Harold Wilson was a sort of actor. I don't know if you remember how he spoke. He used to say, "Have you noticed England only wins a World Cup under a Labour government?" And everyone starts cheering, because that is the only time they won a World Cup. By the way, I haven't cracked up. That is how he spoke. Margaret Thatcher was a great storyteller. In the mid to late 1970s, she was pursuing a radical economic agenda, which made parts of her party deeply uneasy, monetarism. But she used to go around saying, "In his grocer's shop in Grantham, my father never spent more than he earned, and a country can't spend more than it earns." Now, actually, that raises lots of questions about how you run an economy compared to a grocer's shop, but it was brilliant. It made a controversial, highly complex policy, which incidentally she didn't keep to fully in power, accessible to all voters. She was a teacher. And from the left, Tony Benn used to write in his diaries, "I disagree with Margaret about most things, but I do admire the fact that she's a political teacher." And Benn and Thatcher, in a curious way, formed a kind of rapport. Towards the end, when Benn used to speak in the House of Commons on Europe, she used to come in and nod enthusiastically, a curious alliance. Then Blair, the big Labour winner. Labour usually loses elections. Blair won 3. And Blair could have performed Hamlet, King Lear, and Macbeth simultaneously. He was an actor. And again, I don't say this in a derogatory way. He constantly sought to explain why they were doing as they were doing. Cameron tried to copy Blair. It was a sort of imitation, quite effective for a time, but it was too obvious an echo and therefore not authentic enough. And then you come up with Boris Johnson, who is what you see. That is him. I used to co-present a program with him on Radio 4. And he's hard to work out because on one level, there's almost an unexpected shyness when you're with him, one-to-one or in a small group. He loves the stage. Some people tell me that shyness is self-absorption. But whatever it is a performer's art in that it is unique. and people respond to it in certain parts of the country. In other parts, and this is where it's interesting at the moment, that once were quite Tory, they are very wary of it. But that is one of the lessons, I think, that is constant throughout the book. And if you look at those who struggle in some respects, Theresa May, Keir Starmer now, they are not performers and they are not teachers. They don't understand how to convey what they're trying to do, if they know what they're trying to do, to a wider audience. And that is nearly fatal. I think it's an essential qualification of leadership to succeed. Now, that doesn't mean that they are therefore the inevitably most effective or deepest prime ministers in terms of policy making. There is an argument, you don't have to agree with them, that those who delve deepest were kind of the least successful in modern times. Gordon Brown used to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, never go to bed before midnight, worked obsessively, read obsessively, would phone the Archbishop of Canterbury and economists, President, whoever was in power, Obama, look at every single policy in great depth. And indeed, arguably, rose to one of the big challenges of our times, the 2008 financial crash. He knew everybody, having been a chancellor for so long, but he failed in terms of being a winner. He lost the only election he fought as a prime minister and as a Labour leader. And the other one who had depth, these figures who were educated in the 1930s, were brought up in the 30s, then fought in the war, were in a curious way much deeper than our current lot at Westminster, who, to be honest, just objectively are not in the same league as some of these giants from the relatively recent past. And someone like Heath, who had a disastrous premiership, 3-day week, power going off all the time, strikes and all the rest of it. But he was a very experienced cabinet minister and had been a very successful cabinet minister. You can agree or disagree with what he did on Europe, but on its own terms, it was an epic achievement to get Britain into Europe. Harold Macmillan had tried, failed. Wilson almost tried, failed. Heath did it. And my God, if he knew what was happening now, he would be in a bad way. But those people with a depth, a range, who understand what's going on globally, who analyze policy almost to the cows come home, are not necessarily the winners, the durable prime ministers who have many years in power. And so they then don't become the change makers. The change makers need time to bring about an agenda in reality and to change a country which they lead. There's one final observation I'll make at this point, and then we can have a conversation together. And that is this. The British media kind of look at these prime ministers with a sort of awe. I remember talking with the Radio 4 Today programme presenter, John Humphreys. He said, look, the reason I'm rude to these people in interviews and challenge them is that they have all the power. They are so mighty. What struck me writing this book is how miserable these prime ministers are most of the time. They don't feel that powerful or mighty. The obstacles around them almost overwhelm them. If they haven't got a majority in the Commons, it's hellish. The British economy can wobble nightmarishly. Parties are hard to lead. It used to be the case that the Labour Party was almost impossible to lead. Well, recent years have shown that the Conservative Party is almost impossible to lead. Ask Theresa May, David Cameron and others, all who fell as a result of internal disputes over Europe, arguably Margaret Thatcher as well. So although from the outside they're often seen, grand, mighty, out of touch, which I don't think they are out of touch. It's impossible in British politics to be out of touch. The media is hostile or aggressive. You have local elections, opinion polls, focus groups saying they think you look like a chicken or an eagle and it's meant to be insulting. They think apparently Starmer's like an eagle and it's not flattering. And so most of the time they feel besieged rather than omnipotent. There are moments when that crowded, cluttered, Shakespearean political stage does open up a bit. Johnson has experienced such a moment now. He is seen as a winner. That gives him space. His main opponents are fighting amongst themselves. That too gives him huge amounts of space. As I said, Thatcher had it in the late 80s. Blair and Brown together had it, but not Blair on his own, because Brown was always a counter. But that is highly unusual. Most of the time, they are battling it out. And there are some other very interesting things in a kind of Shakespearean way. The origins of their rise often contribute to their fall, as I mentioned, might happen with Johnson and his pitch for Labour seats, with his levelling up agenda, which frankly is way to the left of anything New Labour tried under Tony Blair in 1997. So it's partly a drama, partly a kind of detective story, trying to say, well, look, there's all this surface stuff about these characters who have been the backdrop to our lives. What was it really like wielding power in Britain? And here, those are just a few opening thoughts for you about that reality. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. I wish we could see you, but that's an absolutely fascinating run through some of the really big issues of Prime Ministerial office. We really did get that message that what your book is about is going beyond the surface and in depth. You talk about actors. One of the issues has been around spin rather than depth of policy. Does the acting get in the way of governing?
I think the two, I can hear myself coming back actually, but I don't know whether that dealt. Oh, that's better. No, I don't think so. I think the two are compatible if you are capable of being a policymaker as well. The reason why the acting is so important is you do have to carry voters with you as far as you can. You have to explain why you are doing what you are doing, and you have to do it in an engaging and sincere way. It's like leadership in some of you, I know, well, most of you in the audience are business leaders. You have to carry those you are leading with you. And that does take a bit of almost conscious performance. You know, how are we going to do this next? How am I going to explain this to the staff, say, or the electorate? In terms of policy making, as I say, I think some of the deeper policymakers weren't performers, but it would have actually helped them if they were performers. You know, apparently Heath was incredibly rude to anyone who sort of came near him. There's a wonderful thing in a Heath biography that a very young Chris Patten and another colleague from Conservative Central Office went to see Heath when he was Prime Minister. And they got there at about 11. The meeting carried on for several hours. And Heath ordered a lunch just for him and ate it while they were discussing things. And they emerged starving later. So that sort of thing becomes very counterproductive. But the message about performance, of course, is much wider than how you deal with people. Although, incidentally, that is another important skill. Judging who will help you and working with them. And Johnson, I've praised some of his skills. Johnson hasn't got that. The appointment of Dominic Cummings was a mistake. And Dominic Cummings is on the warpath with perhaps quite explosive consequences. So there are many skills, but no, I don't think it means it gets in the way of policy. But it's a good question because it could do if you're just obsessed with performance and headlines and mistake that for policy implementation.
Answer, Steve. You touched upon in your talk about Tony Blair. I was very fortunate to have met Tony Blair on the campaign trail, and he had this extraordinary quality. He made me feel like I was the only person in the room. You talk about how he changed the style of politics and was a brilliant communicator. Could you talk a bit about this star quality in the context of this idea of a political teacher?
Yeah, well, you can tell, as you say, right away whether someone has star quality. Well, you nearly almost can. Funny enough, you can't always, actually, when I think about it. So, for example, Margaret Thatcher in opposition, a lot of her male colleagues had big doubts whether she could pull it off, leadership, and whether she had that quality. They saw her just as a sort of screeching public figure, not one that could mesmerise. Barbara Castle, the old Labour cabinet minister, said of Margaret Thatcher, power made her beautiful. Now, Castle didn't approve of her policies or politics, but she could see it worked. And with Blair, it was more obvious from when he became Labour leader that he had that spark to light up a room. And as you say, to make someone feel special. My wife, Carrie, reported, she worked in the Northeast and reported on his first election victory in Sedgefield. And he had a drinks do at Number 10 when I knew him as a journalist, where partners were invited. And she came along and she said, "Oh, I covered you in Sedgefield." And Blair said, "Yeah, I remember, yeah, how are you?" And I'm sure he didn't. But there was that important ability to connect. I mean, it was famously based on Bill Clinton, who could give the impression he was in love with whoever he met, and in many cases he was. So, yeah, it is that capacity to light up a room, which is an important. It's by no means the only thing that matters, but it helps them to win elections. And of course, without winning an election, you can't go any further.
Steve, you mentioned Margaret Thatcher there. In your book, you talk about she was one of the few leaders to explain why, not just what. Are there lessons for business in that sphere as well?
Very much so. I'm fascinated by I call it the art of communication and the art of marketing. And I don't say that in a remotely derogatory way. It's clearly not a science, it's an art form. And I think in the same way that she was at her most effective when she explained why they were doing something. Sometimes business leaders assert, oh, tomorrow we're going to do this, and next year this is our plan, and also omit the why question. Now, in fairness, a lot of political leaders do it, make the omission. But it is absolutely fundamental to selling a product, promoting a business, that the why question is accompanied with the what we're doing assertion. Because then you carry with you potential, customers, staff, or whatever. And as I say, certainly in politics, those who address the why question, you might disagree with it. So the Thatcher thing about monetarism, it's like Britain is like a grocer's shop and it's spending too much now and it's got to stop spending. Now that raises thousands of questions because as a state, you're much richer than a grocer's shop. You can print money if you need to and all the rest of it. But it answered the why question. This is why we are proposing certain spending cuts, which you might think will be unpopular, but we are spending too much. Like my dad's grocer's shop, we're going to balance the books. And it was effective. She was a natural teacher. She didn't have kind of spin doctors telling her what to say. She was an instinctive teacher, as Tony Benn noted.
Thank you, Steve. And one of the major themes in your book is about leadership in a crisis of it, in particular inexperienced leaders. Your chapter about Tony Blair and the Iraq War, I think, is very striking on this. What would have happened if he had been in the Foreign Office first?
Yeah, you forget that this is another very interesting element of modern prime ministers. Too many of them go straight into Number 10, having had no previous cabinet experience whatsoever. And that applies to Blair, Cameron, and it almost applies to Boris Johnson. I know he was Foreign Secretary under Theresa May, but she so marginalised him. He might as well have been playing rugby at Eton for the time he was in the Foreign Office. And these people arrive without any sense at all about how other government departments work, and yet they have to rule. And in the case of Cameron and Blair, faced major challenges without really knowing how government works. Now, in the build-up to Iraq, there were many factors that led Blair towards that denouement, not least his obsession with showing that a Labour government could work with a Republican president in the United States. It was Bush, of course, then. But it was also the case that he had never before had to interrogate intelligence. He had never seen another prime minister close at hand interrogating intelligence. So he used to get these intelligence reports, highly speculative. Now, of course, in the end, he used them to make a case. But I also think he didn't understand it. That he hadn't been in the Foreign Office, he hadn't been a Home Secretary, hadn't been a junior Home Office Minister, where intelligence arrives on a daily basis. And you learn to read it like you read music, and you learn to see what's significant and what is highly speculative. So it was partly, though only partly, an inexperience of how government works, and certainly the intelligence agencies work, that led him on this course. But as I think the bigger factor was his determination not to break with the United States over this.
Thank you. I haven't read the book. I've now got quite a soft spot for Harold Wilson. Does he deserve a bit more attention? And if David Cameron had perhaps paid a little bit more attention to one of his predecessors, might Brexit never have happened?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. As I say, I was a kid when Wilson was Prime Minister in his last phase, 74 to 76. But he always intrigued me, partly, as I say, because I read that he was completely bonkers. He needs revising. Look at the Labour Party now, tearing itself apart. Blair saying one thing, John McDonnell, Jeremy Corbyn, another, half the shadow cabinet, implying Starmer's useless and so on. Wilson led a Labour Party split down the middle on every key issue of that time. Europe, state ownership, unilateral nuclear disarmament versus multilateral nuclear disarmament. Each side had advocates who were big figures, whether you agreed with them or not. The left had Ben, Castle, Michael Foot. On the right, you had Dennis Healey, Callaghan, and all these people. And Wilson kept the show on the road. He managed to keep that party united, win 4 elections. And remember, Labour usually loses his British elections. So he was a remarkable figure. And crucially, I said this to David Cameron. I had a coffee with Cameron, as he was moving towards announcing this Brexit referendum. And I said to him, read what Wilson did. I don't think he did. Well, he showed no sign of it, because Wilson held a referendum in 1975 on whether we should stay in the then common market, and won it by a huge majority. And he did some very subtle things. He made his renegotiation, in inverted commas, very accessible, like Thatcher with her economic talk. So he would say, I got virtually nothing like Cameron from his renegotiation, but he would say things like, as a result of my renegotiation, New Zealand butter will still be at a cheap price in Britain. I was, oh yeah, well done, Harold. And he then timed the referendum. He kept his options open and timed it when opinion poll after opinion poll suggested a big win for staying in. Those kind of things. And right from the beginning, he said, right, the cabinet can take different sides. Whereas Cameron hoped to keep the whole cabinet on board. And spent half his time trying to persuade Boris Johnson and others to back him, whereas he should have been spending all the time winning that case. So he and yet Wilson is derided as a kind of disastrous leader in many respects, but I think he definitely needs revising in the light of what has followed in terms of referendums and Labour's inability to remain remotely united and win elections.
Thank you again. I've got a couple more questions and then we'll open it to the audience. Your section on Theresa May about Brexit is really interesting, about PMs giving themselves space to operate. You say May made the right moves at the wrong time. She also appears to have been a bad manager of people, suffering resignation after resignation. How eerie are some of the crossovers, say, with Edward Heath, who didn't really seem to give much thought about how, or even if he wasn't seen, and maybe if Gordon Brown was the right man for the financial crisis, I can attest he was as wooden as a plank. So how would you kind of take that all in? Have PMs made the same mistakes by not looking back in history?
Well, in a way, this is where the Shakespearean thing comes in, that you can't be what you are not. And Theresa May wasn't very political. She arrived, it's easy to forget, when she first became Prime Minister, she was walking on water. She won a leadership contest where all the other candidates just exploded, basically. Johnson went, Gove knifed Johnson, and then Andrea Leadsom pulled out. And her path to Downing Street was clear. The fact that she was not Cameron and gave her this huge authority. She was 20 points ahead in the opinion polls. And she had the space then to tell her party how tough the Brexit thing was going to be, the negotiation. And I think they would have just rallied round, on the whole, not all of them. But instead, she felt weak because she had been a Remainer, although a very quiet Remainer to Cameron's fury. And she sort of just fed them stuff about, we're going to leave quickly. I'm going to sign Article 50. We're going to gain back control. She used quite a lot. And then when she was weak, she tried to be very assertive and say, right, I'm going to work with the Labour Party. In the last few months, she negotiated with Starmer and others. But she was far too weak to do that. So she acted weakly when she was strong and tried to be strong when she was weak. And she didn't really understand politics in a curious way. Keir Starmer reminds me a bit of her in style. Brown was a curious figure. He could be very entertaining, and before he became Chancellor was quite charismatic. Many people thought he would be the next Labour leader on the basis of his political performance. He could be funny, he could speak well. But when he got the Treasury brief in opposition, he just thought he had to become a robot because Labour was so untrusted on the economy. He just had to weigh up every word to the point where, as you say, he became robotic. And it's not so much learning from other people who had failed to perform. They are what they are. And some people learn to change in an interesting way. Someone told me about Wilson. He learned to have a sense of humour. He became funny. But most of them can't change. They rise to the top on the basis of who they are, and they think they will remain at the top on that basis. And then most of them get the shock of their lives when they find they are only ruling very, very precariously.
Thank you. So I'll ask one more question, then we'll open it to the audience. I'm sure lots of people will be interested in Boris Johnson. In your book, you talk about key qualities required for a would-be Prime Minister. Who makes the grade? Put it another way, who's the best and who's the worst?
Yeah, well, this is, of course, partly subjective. We here gathered in the hall and anyone watching on stream, it partly depends on where your politics are. So if you're to the left, you will probably approve more of the Labour ones. And if you're to the right, I suspect you'll approve more of the Tory ones. And that's absolutely fair enough. Politics is partly about ideas and values and debate. It's not a technocratic leadership exercise as business can be. But my book wasn't meant to be about that. I was looking at leadership qualities. And on that basis, you have to recognize the biggest change maker in the period we have, or I have looked at, was Margaret Thatcher. And she came in with a set of ideas, some of them quite sort of simplistic, some of them worked through with, incidentally, her Chancellor, very quiet, dogged figure, Geoffrey Howe, but absolutely crucial. By the way, that's another rule of politics. The relationship between Prime Minister and Chancellor and leader and shadow Chancellor are fundamental. But she came along and changed Britain in a way that she wanted to bring about change. Now, in a more haphazard way, Johnson is doing this. I mean, he will go down in history as the Prime Minister who took Britain out of the European Union, and in doing so, realigned the political map. So it is weird that you look at the political map now, and Blair did this in reverse to some extent, but the Tory strongholds tend to be in the north of England, whereas Labour Labour is solid in London and the cities. And that really wasn't the case in the Thatcher era. So they are examples of change makers in the sort of Clem Attlee mould, to give a Labour Prime Minister who pulled off profound change. But as I said, and implicit in the discussion, in terms of leadership, I admire those who kept their party together. Wilson, in impossible circumstances, did it for years, finished him off. He retired at 60, he looked about 80. And I admire those who do delve deep, even if they weren't vote winners, in terms of leadership. You've got to have a command of detail and range. And so, Brown is an unfashionable figure, but his response to the 2008 crash, I think historians across the political spectrum will come to recognize it as pretty epic. So those are some of the things that I note as leaderly qualities in prime ministers.
Thank you very much indeed. And let's open it up to the audience now, please. This lady here at the front.
Steve, thank you for that. I'm with Polly Toybin. Pure pleasure. I really enjoyed your storytelling and your mimicry. Thank you for that. I'm interested in your thoughts about comparisons with international leaders, and I'm thinking about Merkel in particular this week, and I suppose my question is about not why, but who globally, in terms of the qualities that you've described, who has it to influence what's going on in Gaza and Jerusalem at the moment globally? I'm interested in the UK context, but of course we're none of us islands, and you've made reference to the EU and relationships with Europe. I'm really interested in your thoughts about global leadership.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Brilliant question. By the way, just as an aside, Merkel is a real interesting example of a counter narrative of someone who isn't a performer and yet has ruled majestically and brilliantly for so long in Germany. And I think it does show a very different kind of political culture. German politics is less theatrical than British politics. And she has been an extraordinary leader and a durable leader. In terms specifically of the current Middle East crisis, the key figure, as always with these things, is Biden. Well, it's the American president at any given time. And so Biden is the key figure. He too is interesting because he fought a campaign of extreme caution, but is intervening in the economy in a way that would make, say, Tony Blair or even Keir Starmer alarmed in their caution in comparison with what he is doing. So as far as anyone has the influence to sway, it is inevitably the American president in these situations. He's in a strong position at the moment because he's popular and new. But again, what a contrast between British politics, where people become prime minister more or less around the age of 12 these days, and American politics, where the presidential contest was battled out between two people in their 70s. But you are right. You look at this appalling situation and think, where are the big leaders? Many of them are suffering in the way that I describe British prime ministers as suffering. Macron has got an election coming up next year, and his thoughts are on that. Merkel is going to be leaving quite soon, and it's not entirely clear who will succeed. So I think Biden is the key figure, and is at that point early on in his honeymoon. Most prime ministers get honeymoon, where he has authority to try and do things, but it's a nightmarish situation, and with limited leverage for these leaders outside to make an impact.
Thank you. Lord Digby Jones there at the back.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Steve. It's Digby Jones here.
Hi, Digby. How are you?
I'm all right. Pat and I now live here. We've been here for a couple of years, and it's a lovely, wonderful place. Just don't tell everybody, because we don't want everybody here.
Lucky you. Digby and I, for the audience, Digby and I used to do a lot of. I used to interview him regularly on breakfast television.
You certainly did. You're one of the few people I've ever got up for at 5:30 in the morning, Mr. Richards. Thank you for your time this morning. Look forward to reading the book. And just as an aside, when I was in Gordon Brown's government, I was gobsmacked one day sitting in a meeting, and this man, without notes, knew the budget of every single department. He had no notes. He'd had no briefing. It was not off the record, wrong word to use, but it was off the cuff. And he just walked straight through every single department and said exactly what their spending was. I would actually submit that Tony Blair wouldn't even have been able to spell it.
Yeah. I mean, he was a person of considerable detail, which was a form of integrity, and Tony Blair was very much a big picture figure.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, by the way, as an aside, your series, which about a year or so ago, where you off the cuff, without notes and auto cue, did about 20 minutes on the various great political party divides of the last 200 years, was excellent. Well done. My question is, the Duke of Wellington said halfway through the Battle of Waterloo in the early afternoon of that 18th of June 1815, never interrupt your enemy when he's making a mistake. And as you walked through these prime ministers this morning, I did think that the winners were quite blessed with the lack of quality of an opposition when they went to the country. And I just welcome 5 minutes from you, Steve, on your thoughts on that premise. And once you have a stonking majority, Thatcher, Blair, Johnson, you can do lots, as you said yourself. But one of the reasons they got their stonking majority was, if you'll forgive the vernacular at this time in the morning, but the people they fought in the elections were crap.
Yeah.
Discuss.
Steve, as an addendum to that as well, obviously we had Corbyn and Joe Swinson when we had the prorogation of Parliament. Was Boris lucky, or did he play his cards equally badly or better?
He was very lucky in one very precise sense. So, he wanted to have a general election in December 2019. And Joe Swinson, the Lib Dem leader at the time, and Jeremy Corbyn said yes. Now, actually, they could have stopped it if they wanted. He was on a honeymoon, he was ahead in the opinion polls, and they gave it to him. And Digby's absolutely right that if you look back at the prime ministers who've had space to act, it's partly to do with the majorities, but it's partly to do with the opposition. So in the 80s, Labour were in disarray. Michael Foot and Neil Kinnock were the two opponents to Thatcher. And the internal dynamics of the Labour Party at the time and the leadership gave her that space as well. You look at Blair, the Tories were in complete disarray. William Hague, as he's now admitted, wasn't ready for the job in 1997. Ian Duncan Smith, they had to get rid of within a year or so. And Michael Howard was just there to try and stop total oblivion at the next election. So it is a key factor. An interesting question is it just luck, or is it their skill in causing chaos to the opposition party? And certainly I think Blair was obsessed with the Conservatives, having lost to them all his political career as an MP. He was obsessed in not giving them any space at all. So part of his preoccupation, too much arguably, I mean, he should have been learning the spending budgets of departments, was to always trap the Conservatives into being in a place where they were doomed electorally. And he succeeded in that. I mean, Hager said, facing Blair, there was nothing he could do. He was always in a position where he knew he was going to lose. And Thatcher, to some extent, caused chaos in the Labour Party. She was doing things that the Labour Party at first assumed would be deeply unpopular, and of course were at first in the early 80s. But they thought, therefore, they had the space to say and do what they wanted, and got quite a shock in 83 when they were slaughtered. So it's partly the political skill of the Prime Minister, but it is also luck. And Johnson is an example of that. I mean, the proroguing of Parliament and all of that was part of his big, risky ride, which I mentioned earlier. He had no majority, he was acting like an emperor. But as you suggest, boy, was he lucky in his opponents, not just Corbyn, but Jo Swinson, who thought in a hubristic way she could win the entire general election. And that kind of naivety helped him get that election and the big win.
Did the older Tony and Boris end up on the side of the people and against the establishment? How did he manage to do that? Was that luck or a policy with Dominic Cummings?
Yeah, it's a brilliant question, and the answer is, even ministers aren't quite sure how he's pulled it off. There's a minister going around at the moment, cabinet minister, saying, posing the question, what are we doing right? Which is a nice dilemma to have. It is, when you step back, an extraordinary rapport. An Etonian, editor of The Spectator, columnist of the Daily Telegraph, who incidentally lived in a big house in Islington. He always now says of Starmer, oh, Islington lawyer. Starmer doesn't actually live in Islington, and Johnson did. But he has formed this rapport. It is partly to do with Brexit. Now, as we all know, Johnson was torn about Brexit and couldn't quite decide which side to campaign on. However, once you make that call, you stick with it, and he has stuck with it. And I think it is a lot to do with Brexit. And as you suggest, Cummings then framed it as the people versus the elites. And the people, it resonated enough on the basis that that Parliament was trying to stop the outcome of the 2016 Brexit referendum. So I think that formed the basis. And then, as Blair noted this week when somebody asked him, what is Johnson's appeal? You add that to the fact he's a character. He's funny. Humour is a massive weapon in leadership of any form. And he makes people laugh. And when people laugh, they're kind of with you. So I think it's a combination of Brexit and his character. But I do think there is a bigger question about how sustainable it is, because it is obviously false. He is not one of them. I mean, I'm sure the first time he'd been to Hartlepool was during that by-election. And he is what he is, which is someone who went to Eton, Oxford, and then the rest. But that, I think, explains it, his character and Brexit.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? Yes, former Chief Minister Gavin St Pierre at the back there.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Steve, for your talk this morning. In your book, you describe Heath as having ideological purpose in opposition, which perhaps he lost when he was Prime Minister, or didn't appear to have when he was Prime Minister. And you've also spoken this morning about perhaps the ideological purpose of Thatcher and Blair, and to some extent Johnson with Brexit. And it's a sort of two-part question. To what extent is ideological purpose important? And in relation specifically to Johnson, second part to the question, is levelling up an ideological purpose which he's perhaps recently acquired, or is it one that you believe he's committed to?
Thank you. A brilliant question. On the first point, ideological purpose, I think, is essential. And in that sense, my analysis of leadership kind of misses an element out in that I don't say whether or not I approve of the ideological purpose, because I'm trying to look at leadership in a broader sense. But it's the essence of democratic politics. It should be a battle of ideas with different versions of values and the policies that arise from them. And I think those with an ideological purpose and the ability to connect with voters are in a strong position of leadership. Clearly, ideological purpose isn't enough on its own, or else Jeremy Corbyn would now be Prime Minister. You have to have the capacity to connect as well. In terms of Johnson, I think there is one and only one area of policy or values where he is ideological, and it caused him huge problems early on with the pandemic. It might still be doing so with this Indian variant. He is, as any of you who've read his columns will know, he's a libertarian. He doesn't believe in the state telling people how to behave. And that's been a constant thing, both in his public life and, as you all know, in his private life. He does what he wants to do in his private life. And that he applies publicly as well. And of course, that's why he struggled early on with lockdowns and all the rest of it. But beyond that constant, there is no ideological fixture for Boris Johnson. Someone who worked with him as London Mayor said, what people don't know about Boris is he's a Keynesian. On economic policy, he's sort of left of centre. And there is some evidence to back that up. He describes himself as a Rooseveltian. Build back better, Roosevelt, New Deal. But I watched on YouTube when I wrote the chapter on Boris Johnson, a lecture he gave to a Tory think tank on the anniversary of Margaret Thatcher's death, where he described her and her policy, her as his heroine, and that she revived the British economy via Thatcherism, which is not Keynesianism. So he is all over the place, but that does give him the space, certainly when, as Digby suggested, facing a weak opposition, to constantly redefine. I don't think he fully knows what the policy consequences of levelling up are, or the spending implications of levelling up. I mean, they're getting away at the moment with relatively small things, a free port, a bit of the Treasury moving to Darlington. But these voters will expect more than that over the next few years. And in Whitehall, people say, well, what is this levelling up? What does it mean? So it's been highly effective electorally. But now is the big test in terms of implementation. And I don't think he has got a great ideological compass.
Steve, do you have any other questions? Yep, Jenny.
Thank you. Jenny Tasker, slightly different tack, Steve. I've thoroughly enjoyed what you've been saying. When I was growing up, Rab Butler was always said to be the best Prime Minister that Britain never had. Now, are there any of the other big hitters that you have mentioned in government, in various cabinet posts over the years, that would have perhaps made better Prime Ministers than those that were finally elected? Your analysis of people's behaviour and their interests and so on might give us an insight into that. Thank you.
Well, even though we're not all together in the same room, that is, there must be some connection, to use that word, because I've just literally finished a book called, it's the sequel, The Prime Ministers We Never Had. So maybe we can all get together in reality at some point when the book comes out, and I'll talk about it. And it begins with Rab Butler, and it explores exactly that question. So, I might just be a voice in the hall, but you've guessed something amazing. And I found it more interesting to write than the Prime Ministers, for exactly as you suggest. I won't tell you all the people who are in it. That will be a surprise. It's coming out later this year, and then paperback actually this time next year. But it is so interesting that at certain points, there are individuals who look as if they're about to be the next prime minister, or are talked about certainly in terms of being a prime minister. I mean, some of them are obvious. Michael Heseltine, Dennis Healey, say. Why don't they make it? What is the thing that's missing that means they don't get to the top? And there are many answers. As, again, the book is sort of like a detective story trying to work out why the likes of Healey or Heseltine didn't. And I won't go into it all now because it's not another time. But one of the things is Britain is a party-based system, even though the culture, the media culture is presidential. You know, the whole focus is on prime ministers and leaders. But quite often, those who appear prime ministerial are at odds with their party in a way that makes it impossible for them to become leader stroke prime minister. And the big schism, of course, between party and potential prime ministers has been Europe. I'm not giving too much away to say Ken Clarke features in the book to come. And he used to say, still does, my hobby later in my career was to fight Conservative leadership contests and lose them. And each time the polls of the wider electorate suggest he was the most popular. But of course he couldn't win. He was wholly at odds with his party on Europe. Some of the prime ministers we never had, if we had a presidential system, may well have become presidents, but not with the party-based system. There are many other factors to do with personality, timing, and all kinds of things. I found it fascinating, and thank you for the prophetic question.
Thank you very much indeed. I think we'll now draw the event to a close. Steve, thank you very much. We're really looking forward to your next thriller. Thank you to the audience, and we'll pass you over to Guy from Butterfield now. Thank you again.
Well, thank you very much again. Thanks go to our sponsor. Clearly, we're very grateful to being here and to sponsor this event. I do have a few thank yous to say, so forgive me. Thanks to Steve. Hugely interesting, and I think what I take from there is performers, leaders, learners, and bonkers. That sums it all up. So thank you very much. We can't see you, but awfully nice to hear you. Thanks to Will. Thank you very much for comparing that. Fantastic event. Thank you to the Literary Festival, and thank you to Rob for that most wonderful introduction. We are very genuinely pleased to be here and to sponsor. Thanks also go to the Literary Festival and the support staff, the volunteers, and to the OGH yet again for the wonderful event and breakfast, which we hope you've thoroughly enjoyed. Lastly, and cantering through this, forgive me because I know we're running short of time, but we do hope you've enjoyed it. Certainly the content has been very interesting, and the thoughts as well have been inspiring and intellectual. So have a wonderful day. Thank you.